Lena stood before the mirror in her small dressing room, staring at her reflection. The person looking back didn't feel like her. She was wearing a white wedding dress with delicate lace and a veil that she had picked out months ago, imagining this would be the happiest day of her life. But now, the dress felt heavy, as though it was pressing down on her shoulders, and the veil seemed more like a mask than a symbol of joy. Her fingers trembled as she adjusted it one last time, trying to calm the uneasy feeling growing inside her. "Almost time," her mother Victoria said as she entered the room. She moved with quiet steps, her voice soft, but her green eyes, identical to Lena's, held a worry she couldn't hide. "Graham is already at the church," she added with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Lena nodded, unable to speak. Her stomach felt like it was twisting into knots. She told herself it was normal to feel nervous before getting married. After all, she was about to start a new chapter with Graham Matthews, the man who had swept her off her feet with his charming smile and kind words. She remembered how they met at the little cafe where she worked while finishing her master's degree in literature. He was the man who had promised to build a life with her, the man she thought she knew so well. "Where's Isla?" Lena asked, her voice unsteady. Isla, her twin sister and maid of honor, was supposed to be there to help her get ready. Victoria hesitated for a moment, the corners of her mouth tightening. "She'll be here soon, dear. You know how Isla is with time," she said, her tone light, though her eyes flickered with something Lena couldn't quite place. But Isla didn't come. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. Lena checked her phone over and over, but there were no messages or missed calls. The bouquet of white roses and pink peonies on the table next to her remained untouched, its beauty a quiet contrast to the growing worry in the room. The door burst open suddenly, and Lena's father, Robert, walked in. His usually calm face was contorted with an expression Lena had never seen before. "Graham's not at the church," he said, his voice sharp and heavy, each word hitting her like a hammer. Lena blinked, her mind struggling to process what he had just said. "What?" she whispered. "He's not there," Robert repeated, and then, as if it hurt him to say it, he added, "He's with Isla." They were seen leaving town together. The words shattered something inside Lena. It felt as though the ground had vanished beneath her feet. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Memories of the past few months came rushing back, Graham's sudden excuses for being late, Isla's unexpected absences from family dinners, the way they had exchanged glances that she had dismissed as nothing. "No," she murmured, her voice breaking. Tears streamed down her face, and she clutched at her chest as if trying to hold her heart together. "No, no, no." Victoria wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her tightly as she cried. "Oh, my girl," she whispered, her own tears falling. "He'll regret this. Every moment, every breath, he'll regret it." Lena's sorrow quickly turned to anger. She ripped the veil off her head and threw it to the floor as though it were something poisonous. She looked back at the mirror, and the woman staring back wasn't the same one who had stood there just an hour ago. Her makeup was smudged, leaving black streaks on her cheeks, and her green eyes burned with a mix of pain and fury. The following days were a blur of emotions. The sharp pain of Graham's betrayal was like a dagger that twisted every time she thought of him. But even worse was the deep, soul-crushing hurt caused by Isla, her twin sister, her other half, the person she had trusted more than anyone. Lena couldn't understand how Isla could have done something so cruel. The apartment she had shared with Graham became unbearable. Every corner held memories of a life they had planned together, now tainted by lies and betrayal. The photos on the walls, the furniture they had chosen together, all of it felt like it was mocking her. One night, as she packed her belongings into cardboard boxes, Lena made a decision. She couldn't stay there. She couldn't keep reliving the pain in a place that was filled with broken promises. With trembling hands, She typed an email to her company, requesting a transfer to their office in Seattle, far away from her hometown. The next morning, she received a reply approving her transfer. For the first time in days, Lena felt a tiny flicker of hope. At breakfast, she told her mother about her decision. "Are you sure about this?" Victoria asked, her voice full of concern. "No," Lena admitted honestly, "but I can't stay here. Everywhere I look, I see reminders of them, of what they did. I need to leave, to figure out who I am without all of this." Victoria reached across the table and squeezed Lena's hand. "Sometimes," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "we have to lose everything to find out who we really are." That night, Lena cried one last time for everything she had lost, not just for Graham and Isla, but for the future she had imagined. As the tears fell, she promised herself that she wouldn't let this betrayal define her. When she arrived in Seattle, the rain greeted her like an old friend. Her new apartment was small but cozy, and she spent her first few days unpacking and getting used to the constant sound of raindrops on the windows. It was a bittersweet melody that matched her mood perfectly. Her mother sent her messages every day, sharing updates about home and asking how she was settling in. One day, a message came that stopped Lena in her tracks. "Graham and Isla are back. They got married in Las Vegas," it read. Lena dropped the coffee cup she had been holding, watching helplessly as the dark liquid spread across the carpet. The news shouldn't have surprised her, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. She sat down, her hands trembling, and took several deep breaths before finally cleaning up the mess. At work, Lena threw herself into her new job. Her boss, Diana Morrison, was a kind woman in her 50s with short gray hair and a sharp sense of understanding. "I'd like you to edit Theo Parker's new manuscript," Diana said during a meeting. Theo Parker was a well-known author whose books Lena had always admired. "I'd be honored," Lena replied, feeling a spark of excitement for the first time in weeks. After the meeting, Diana called her into her office. "I know you've been through a lot," she said gently. "Your mom is an old friend, and she told me you needed a fresh start. Use what you've been through to guide your work. Sometimes our greatest pains can become our greatest strengths." That evening, Lena decided to explore her new neighborhood. She wandered the streets until she stumbled upon a little bookstore tucked between a cafe and a record store. The sign above the door read, "The Bookmark." Inside, the smell of books and freshly brewed coffee filled the air. A man behind the counter looked up and smiled. "Welcome to the Bookmark," he said warmly. "I'm Elliot. Let me know if you need help." Lena smiled back, surprised by how natural it felt. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, letting their titles and textures distract her from her thoughts. "You're new to the neighborhood," Elliot said, his tone friendly. "I can always tell. The regulars here have a certain look of familiarity when they walk in." Lena picked up a book at random and said, "That obvious?" Elliot chuckled. "Seattle has a way of drawing in people with heartbreak. Something about the rain and the coffee. It helps people heal." Lena found herself talking with Elliot for hours, laughing at his stories about the bookstore and its customers. By the time she left, she felt lighter, as though some of the weight on her chest had been lifted. Back at her apartment, Lena opened a notebook and began to write. It wasn't a diary or a story, just fragments of her thoughts about pain, hope, and the possibility of starting over. As the words flowed, so did her feelings, and she began to feel a sense of release. Before going to bed, she replied to her mom's message. "I'm starting to find my place here," she wrote. "The pain hasn't gone away, but maybe it doesn't have to. Maybe I just need to learn how to turn it into something else." Lena was at her desk, staring at a manuscript filled with colorful sticky notes and handwritten comments in the margins. She had been working on the story for 3 weeks and was finally beginning to understand why her boss, Diana, had trusted her with this project. The book was written by an author named Theo Parker and told the story of a woman who had lost everything in a fire. She didn't just have to rebuild her house, but her entire life, figuring out who she was now that everything familiar was gone. Lena let out a deep sigh and marked another passage with her red pencil. "It's almost cruel," she muttered, thinking about how the book's protagonist felt eerily similar to her. Lena was also trying to rebuild her life after losing so much. She wasn't just editing the book, she was editing her own feelings, trying to make sense of everything that had happened to her. A ping from her phone broke her concentration. She hesitated to check it. Ever since moving to Seattle, Lena had avoided social media. It was too painful. Seeing pictures of Graham, her ex-fiancé, and Ela, her twin sister who had betrayed her, was the last thing she needed. But this notification wasn't from either of them. It was from Elliot, the kind and thoughtful man who worked at a small bookstore she loved. "I just got a special book," the message said. "It's an old first edition of Pride and Prejudice. I thought you might want to see it before someone else buys it." Lena smiled for the first time that day. Over the past few weeks, Elliot and his cozy bookstore had become her refuge. He always seemed to know what she needed: a quiet corner, a warm cup of tea, or, in this case, a beautiful book to distract her. She packed Theo Parker's manuscript into her bag and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. The streets of Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood were lined with trees, their leaves golden and scattered on the sidewalks. The smell of coffee and cinnamon drifted from nearby cafes, and Lena found herself relaxing a little. Seattle was beginning to feel less like a place to hide and more like home. When she entered the bookstore, the air was warm and smelled like old paper and fresh coffee. Elliot was behind the counter, unpacking a box of books. His reading glasses sat crooked on his nose, and his friendly smile lit up when he saw her. "I think you'll like this," he said, carefully pulling a leather-bound book from the box. "It's an 1894 edition." Lena took the book from him gently, holding it like it might break. "It's beautiful," she whispered, running her fingers over the worn cover. Elizabeth Bennet also had to face her pride and prejudices to find her happiness, Elliot said, watching her closely. Lena raised an eyebrow, though her tone was playful. "Are you trying to teach me something?" "Maybe," Elliot replied with a shrug. "Just the thought that sometimes we have to rewrite our own stories." Lena laughed softly and put the book on the counter. Speaking of rewriting, Theo Parker's story is intense. Sometimes it feels like he's writing about me. But he wrote this book long before he even knew I existed, so that's ridiculous, right? Elliot didn't answer. Before he could say anything, Lena's phone buzzed again. This time it was a notification from her mother. She'd posted a picture from a family reunion in Boston. Lena's stomach tightened as she opened it. In the corner of the photo, almost cut out, were Graham and Ela. The light caught their wedding rings, making them shine. Lena quickly put her phone down, her face pale. Elliot noticed her change in mood and stepped closer. "Coffee?" he offered. Lena shook her head. "I need something stronger." Later that evening, Elliot took her to a jazz club called the Blue Note. The small, dimly lit room was filled with the sound of a saxophone playing a sad melody. Lena sipped a Manhattan and, for the first time, talked openly about her feelings. "You know what's funny?" she said, swirling her drink. "Ursula always wanted everything I had. When we were kids, it was my toys, my books. I thought it was just sibling rivalry. I never imagined she'd want my fiancé." "And she got him," Elliot said quietly. "She did." Lena laughed bitterly. "And the worst part is, I still don't understand why. I mean, she's my sister. How could she do this to me?" Elliot leaned forward, his eyes serious. "If you could have it all back, Graham, your life in Boston, would you want it?" Lena was startled by the question. She thought about it carefully, listening to the music in the background. Finally, she shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "I can't trust someone who betrayed me like that. And Ela, she'll always be my sister, but she can never be my friend again." Elliot smiled gently. then maybe they didn't really take anything that was truly yours. His words stayed with Lena as she walked home. That night, she sat down at her laptop and started writing. Not her usual notes on Theo's manuscript, but something of her own. A story about two sisters, imperfect reflections of each other, and how love could sometimes hurt more than it healed. The next day, Lena got an email from Theo Parker. He wanted to meet in person to discuss her notes. She felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. Theo's writing was so raw, so full of emotion. It was like he could see into her soul, even though they'd never met. At work, her boss, Diana, called her into the office. On her desk was a magazine open to a photo of Graham and Isla at their wedding. Diana looked at Lena kindly. "Do you know them?" she asked. Lena nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, he was my fiancée. She's my twin sister." Diana sighed. "I thought you should know. Graham just bought Riverside Press in Boston. They're now one of our biggest competitors on the East Coast." The news hit Lena like a wave of cold water. Graham had always dreamed of growing his family's publishing business, and now he was doing it. With Isla. But she straightened her shoulders and said firmly, "It won't affect my work." Diana smiled. "I know, but I thought you should be prepared. There's a conference in Vancouver next month, and they'll probably be there." Lena left the office feeling drained. That evening, Elliot invited her to a poetry night at his bookstore. She smiled at his message, but was quickly brought back to reality by another notification, this one from Isla. "I'm coming to Seattle next week. Please, we need to talk." Lena's heart raced. After months of silence, Isla wanted to meet her now, the same week Theo Parker was visiting. At the poetry night, Lena told Elliot about the message. "Are you going to see her?" he asked. "I don't know," Lena admitted. "Part of me wants to yell at her, demanding answers, but another part of me thinks nothing she says will ever be enough." Elliot nodded. "There's a poem I love that says, 'Someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to understand that this too was a gift.'" Lena felt tears prick her eyes. What kind of gift is betrayal? "Maybe the kind that forces you to find your own light," Elliot said softly. The day before Isla arrived, Lena received another message. Isla had booked a table at an expensive restaurant. It was typical of her, always choosing the fanciest place. Elliot told Lena she didn't owe Isla anything, but Lena knew she had to go. At the restaurant, Lena was deliberately late. When she arrived, Isla stood up, looking nervous. She was thinner than Lena remembered, and her eyes looked tired. "You came," Isla said softly. Lena sat down without a hug. "You didn't leave me much choice." As they talked, Isla apologized and tried to explain herself. Lena listened, but didn't say much. She wasn't sure if she could forgive her sister, but she knew she needed to hear the words. That night, Lena wrote a new line in her story. "Sometimes the ghosts of the past visit us, not to haunt us, but to set us free." Lena replied in a calm but firm voice, her gaze steady as she watched Isla closely. "Does the ring fit well? I hope so, considering its emotional price." Her words were sharp but measured, carrying the weight of all the hurt she had buried deep inside. Isla closed her eyes as if the words had physically struck her. She took a shaky breath, her voice trembling as she tried to speak. "Lena, please," she began, her tone pleading. "I know what we did was terrible, but—" "No," Lena interrupted sharply, her voice low but resolute. "Don't you dare make it sound small. You and Graham didn't just betray me. You planned it while I was out picking flowers for my wedding." Her voice faltered, the pain of the memory still fresh, but she quickly steadied herself. For a moment, Isla hesitated. Then, as if she couldn't hold it back any longer, she blurted out, "Graham was never really yours." The words spilled out before she could stop them, and immediately she clapped her hands over her mouth, as if trying to force them back in. Lena froze. The air seemed to leave her lungs. "What did you just say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Isla's tears came fast now, streaming down her face as she spoke. He's always been in love with me, Lena, from the very first time we met at your engagement party. Her voice cracked as she admitted the truth. But you looked so happy, and I tried to ignore it. I swear I did. I never wanted to hurt you. Then why didn't you tell me? Lena demanded, her voice rising with raw emotion. Why let it go on until my wedding day? Why let me plan everything, every little detail, while you and Graham... She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Isla sobbed harder now. Because I always wanted to be like you, she shouted, the words tumbling out as if a dam had broken. You were always the smart one, the talented one, the special one. Mom and Dad treated you differently, Lena. They always did. And then Graham came along, and he was yours, just like everything else. Lena felt a bitter laugh rising in her throat. She let it out, the sound harsh and joyless. You still don't get it, do you? She said, shaking her head. This isn't about Graham. It never was. It's about you, my twin sister, my other half, choosing to destroy me in the worst way possible. And for what? Because you thought you weren't good enough? Just then, the waiter appeared at their table, ready to take their orders. But Lena didn't even glance at him. She stood up, pushing her chair back with a scrape. I'm not staying, she said firmly. I can't sit here and look at you without feeling disgusted. Lena, please, Isla begged, reaching out to grab her sister's arm. Her voice cracked with desperation. Graham and we're not happy. He compares everything I do to you. Nothing I do is ever enough for him. Lena looked down at Isla's hand on her arm. Slowly and deliberately, she pried it loose and stepped back. That's called karma, Isla, she said, her voice icy. You built your happiness on the ruins of mine. How did you think that would turn out? Without waiting for a reply, Lena turned and walked out of the restaurant into the cold, rainy Seattle night. The fine drizzle soaked her hair, but she barely noticed. She needed the fresh air, needed space to breathe. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She pulled it out and saw a message from Theo Parker, the author whose manuscript she had been editing for weeks. I loved your notes on the manuscript, the message read, especially the part about how some betrayals free us to find our true strength. Coffee tomorrow? Lena stopped on the sidewalk, letting the rain sprinkle her face. Her hands trembled slightly as she typed her reply. Yes. Across the street, the Bookmark, her favorite bookstore, glowed warmly in the night. Its cozy interior was a welcome refuge from the storm. Lena crossed the street and stepped inside. Elliot, the store's manager and her closest friend in Seattle, was busy stacking books on a high shelf. When he saw her, he immediately stopped what he was doing and walked over, concern etched on his face. Without a word, he opened his arms, and Lena stepped into his embrace. She let herself relax against him, breathing in the comforting scent of old books and coffee that always seemed to cling to him. How did it go? Elliot asked softly, his voice full of understanding. Lena sighed, resting her head against his chest. I found out that my sister is still the same insecure girl she's always been. She always wanted to be me. And maybe, just maybe, I'm finally ready to just be myself. Elliot pulled back slightly to look at her, a small smile playing on his lips. That sounds like a victory to me. Lena nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. Was it really a victory? Or was it just another battle in a war that had started long before she realized it? The next morning, Lena arrived early at the cafe in Pike Place Market where she was meeting Theo Parker. She carried her notebook full of notes under her arm, her mind buzzing with thoughts about his manuscript and her own tangled feelings about her past. Theo Parker arrived a few minutes later. He was a man in his 50s, with sharp eyes behind thin-framed glasses and a calm, steady presence. Lena Reynolds, he said warmly, holding out his hand. She shook it, smiling politely. Mr. Parker, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. Theo, please, he said, taking a seat across from her. Your notes on my manuscript were revealing, to say the least. especially your comments on how the protagonist deals with the loss of her identity. Lena blushed slightly, feeling self-conscious. I just did my job, she said modestly. Theo leaned forward, his gaze intent. No, you did much more than that. You understood Helena in a way no other editor could. It was as if you intimately knew what it felt like to have your life destroyed and to rebuild it from scratch. Lena didn't know how to respond to that. She took a sip of her coffee, trying to gather her thoughts. Diana showed me some excerpts of your own writing, Theo said, his voice gentle but firm. The story about the twin sisters. Lena froze. She hadn't expected her boss to share those private unfinished drafts. She shouldn't have done that, she said quietly. Maybe not, Theo admitted, pulling a brown envelope from his briefcase, but I'm glad she did, because I want to make you an offer. He slid the envelope across the table to her. Inside was a contract from Pacific Northwest Publishing. I want you to continue editing my book, Theo explained, but I also want you to write your own. Lena stared at him, her mind reeling. I'm not a writer, she said weakly. We're all writers when we have a story that needs to be told, Theo replied with a knowing smile. And your story, Lena, needs to be told. That afternoon, as Lena walked through the market with the contract tucked in her bag, her emotions were a swirling mix of excitement and fear. Could she really do this? Her phone rang. It was her mother, Victoria. Isla called me crying, Victoria said without preamble. What happened at dinner? Lena stopped in front of a flower stall, the colorful bouquets catching her eye. She sighed deeply. The truth came out, Mom. Finally. Victoria was silent for a moment. Then she said, She told me you hate her. Lena was surprised at her own certainty when she replied, I don't hate her. I just finally understand that love and forgiveness are two different things. And Graham? Her mother asked hesitantly. Lena closed her eyes, thinking of Isla's confession about how Graham constantly compared her to Lena. Graham is reaping what he sowed, she said simply. That evening, back at the bookmark, Elliot was helping a customer reach a book on a high shelf when Lena walked in. I've got news, she announced as soon as the customer left. Elliot raised an eyebrow, noticing the mixture of emotions on her face. Good or bad? Both, she said with a nervous laugh, handing him the contract. Elliot read it, his eyebrows climbing higher with each line. This is amazing, Lena. But why do you look so scared? Because, she admitted, sinking into her usual armchair, what if I fail? What if I write this story and prove Isla was right, that I'm not as special as everyone thought? Elliot knelt down beside her, taking her hands in his. You're already writing this story, he said gently. Every choice you've made since you came to Seattle is part of it. Every moment of strength, even when it would have been easier to give up, that's your story. For the first time, Lena let herself believe he might be right. That night, she opened her laptop and began to write, not just notes or fragments, but the true beginning of her story. There are many kinds of betrayal, she wrote. Some come from strangers, others from friends, but the worst, the ones that cut the deepest, come from those who should be our reflection in the mirror. Lena felt a warm, soft hand resting on hers. It was Elliot's hand, and he hadn't moved it away. She liked the way it felt. But before she could say anything, the phone in the bookstore rang loudly. Elliot stood up to answer it. As he walked away, Lena felt a bit lonely, missing the warmth of his touch. It's for you, Elliot said, his face looking serious. Your mom. Lena quickly picked up the phone. On the other end, her mother's voice sounded worried and shaky. Isla is in the hospital, her mom said. She lost the baby. For a moment, Lena couldn't breathe. Baby? She whispered. She was 2 months along. She wanted to tell you at dinner, but her mom's voice trailed off. Lena remembered how Isla had seemed different lately. Thinner, quieter, her hands shaking as she held her napkin. Is Graham with her? Lena asked. Graham was Isla's husband. No, her mom said, sounding upset. He's on a business trip and said he couldn't come back. After hanging up, Lena sat still, the phone in her hand. Elliot came back to her, looking worried. I need to go to Boston, Lena said softly. Are you sure? Elliot asked gently. She's my sister, Lena replied, surprised by how sure she felt. No matter what, I can't leave her alone now. Elliot nodded. I'll take you to the airport. As they drove in the rain, Lena stared out the window. The lights of the city blurred into colorful smudges on the glass. She thought about the book she was writing, about forgiveness and how some wounds don't fully heal. Instead, we learn to carry them more gently over time. She could still hurt you, Elliot said as they arrived at the airport. I know, Lena said, holding his hand for a moment. But maybe that's what being family is, loving each other, even when it's hard. Promise me you'll come back? Elliot asked. Seattle is my home now, she replied, and they both knew she wasn't just talking about the city. On the plane, Lena opened her laptop and began writing a new chapter for her book. Her words felt different now, full of a deeper understanding of love, pain, and forgiveness. When Lena arrived in Boston, she went straight to the hospital. The building was big and gray, made of concrete and glass. It looked cold and unfriendly. Lena walked down the hallway of the 5th floor, passing rooms with their doors partly open. The smell of the hospital, a mix of cleaners and sadness, filled the air. Finally, she reached Isla's room. Her twin sister was lying in bed, her back turned to the door. I told you. I don't need anything, Mom, Illa said without turning around. It's not Mom, Lena said softly. Illa turned quickly, her face pale and tired. Lena? Did you come? Lena walked closer to the bed and saw a pile of hospital papers neatly folded on the table. She sat down beside her sister. Of course, I came, Lena said. Tears filled Isla's eyes. She began to cry, and Lena did something she hadn't done in a long time. She hugged her sister. I didn't even tell Graham, Isla said between sobs. I wanted to make sure everything was okay first, but now. Lena gently stroked Isla's hair, which was just like her own. Where's Graham? She asked. He's in Chicago. He said he couldn't cancel his meetings, Isla said bitterly. I guess I always knew he didn't really love me. I was just his way of getting close to you. Lena didn't know what to say. They sat in silence until their mom walked in, carrying cups of coffee. For a moment it felt like the old days, the three of them together. But things weren't the same anymore. There was a new tension between them. The next day, Lena helped Isla leave the hospital and took her home. Graham wasn't there. His silence spoke loudly. You don't have to stay, Isla said when they got inside. You've already done more than I deserve. Lena looked around the apartment. It was filled with expensive furniture, but it felt empty. No photos, no personal touches. It didn't feel like a home. Do you remember when we were little? Lena asked. You always said you wanted to be just like me. Illa nodded, her eyes wet with tears. The problem, Lena said gently, is that you were already amazing as yourself. You didn't need to be my reflection. Illa looked down, her voice small. What do I do now? Now, Lena said, you start building your own life. Before heading back to Seattle, Lena stopped at Riverside Press, where Graham worked. She found him sitting in his office, looking out at the harbor. Lena, he said, surprised. I'm sorry for your loss. No, Lena said firmly. If you were sorry, you'd be with your wife right now. Graham slumped into his chair, looking ashamed. I've ruined everything, haven't I? Yes, Lena said simply. But I didn't come here for you. I came to tell you I won't be working with Riverside Press anymore. Some lines shouldn't be crossed. On the flight back to Seattle, Lena worked on her book. Her words felt stronger now, filled with hope and a deeper understanding of love and forgiveness. Sometimes, forgiveness isn't one big moment, she wrote. It's small acts of kindness we show, even when it's hard. When Lena got back to Seattle, the sun was shining. A rare thing. It made the city look bright and new. She dropped off her bags and headed straight to the bookmark, Elliot's bookstore. When she walked in, she saw Elliot reading a story to a group of children. He looked up and saw her, his face breaking into a big smile. You're back, he said after the last child had left. I promised, didn't I? Lena said, smiling back. That night, Elliot showed Lena something special, an old printing press in the back of the store. I was thinking, Elliot said nervously, we could use this to make a special edition of your book, handmade, something really unique. Lena touched the machine, feeling its smooth, cold surface. Elliot, she started, but he interrupted her. It's not just about the book, he said. Since you walked into the store, everything's changed. For me, for you. These books used to be my safe place, but now you're my safe place. Lena's heart felt so full. When Elliot leaned in, they shared their first kiss. It felt like the perfect ending to one story and the start of a new one. The next morning, Lena received 2 emails. One was from her publisher saying her book would be published in a big magazine. The other was from Isla. Graham moved out yesterday, Isla wrote. He said he couldn't get over the fact that he chose the wrong sister. But I think I finally understand. It wasn't about him choosing. It was about me choosing myself. I'm starting therapy and writing again. I hope one day we can be something new, something real. Lena reread the email, her heart feeling both heavy and light. She opened her manuscript and began to write. True love isn't about filling what we've lost. It's about helping each other grow into who we're meant to be. The setting sun painted the world outside in golden colors, its light streaming through the windows and making the bookshelves look like magical castles full of stories. Elliot hugged Lena from behind as they both looked out at the city. You know, Elliot said, when you first came here, feeling so sad and looking for a safe place, I never thought I'd see you become a writer. Lena turned around in his arms and smiled. And I never thought I'd find more than just a safe place. I found everything I needed. Later, Lena was at a big meeting for book writers and publishers in Vancouver. It was a huge, busy place with many important people talking about books. Lena wore a badge that said she was one of the speakers, but she still felt like she didn't belong. Theo, her friend, walked beside her. He pointed to some people, explaining who they were. When they stopped in front of the main hall, he whispered, "Breathe. You've got this." Before Lena could reply, she saw 2 familiar faces, Graham and Isla. Graham was her ex-fiancé and Isla was her twin sister. Graham looked a bit older now, with gray in his hair, and Isla seemed different, stronger, calmer, and more like herself. Lena, Graham said, his voice tight, your story in the literary magazine was amazing. Thank you, Lena replied, surprised by how calm she felt. Graham hesitated. I'm selling my part of Riverside Press. I realized I was trying to prove something I didn't need to prove. Isla stayed quiet, her eyes on Lena. Lena noticed Isla wasn't wearing her wedding ring anymore. Lena, Isla finally said, can we talk alone? Theo squeezed Lena's shoulder to show he believed in her, then walked away with Graham. Lena and Isla found a quiet corner near a window with a view of the Vancouver mountains. I've started writing too, Isla said suddenly. Not a book, but letters. Letters to the baby I lost, to you and to myself. My therapist thought it might help. Lena's throat felt tight. Does it help? She asked. Isla gave a sad smile. Yes, it helps me see that it was never really about Graham. It was about me wanting to be like you instead of figuring out who I am. Lena's heart softened. And who are you now? I'm still figuring that out, Isla said honestly. But for the first time, I'm okay with not having all the answers. Graham and I are done. He never really got over you, and I never got over trying to be you. Lena held Isla's hand. Even though their hands looked the same, Lena could feel that they were now 2 different people with their own stories and journeys. I read your book, Isla said. Theo sent me a copy. It was painful to read, but it was also the truth. Lena tried to apologize, but Isla stopped her. No, you don't need to soften anything. Your story deserves to be told, even the parts where I seemed like the bad guy. You're not the bad guy, Lena said gently. We're all just people trying to figure things out. Before they could say more, an announcement reminded them that the main event was starting in 5 minutes. Lena was one of the big speakers, sharing her story about how she became a writer. "I'll be in the front row," Isla promised. On stage, with bright lights shining on her, Lena looked at the big crowd. She saw Theo smiling, Graham sitting uncomfortably in the back, and Ela in the front, tears shining in her eyes. "Stories," Lena began, "can break us and then help us put ourselves back together." She talked about how writing her book taught her about forgiveness, especially forgiving herself. As she spoke, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Elliot. "You're amazing. The bookstore feels so empty without you." Lena smiled and kept talking, explaining how losing everything helped her find herself again, and how love for people, books, or yourself can heal even the deepest wounds. Later, in the hotel lobby, Isla found Lena. "I'm moving to London," Isla said. "I got a job at an art gallery. It's time for me to build my own story in a place where no one compares me to you." Lena felt tears on her cheeks. "I'll miss you." "I'll miss you too," Isla said with a brave smile. "But this goodbye is a healthy one, not an escape." The sisters hugged, and Lena felt that their bond had changed. Instead of being like two mirrors reflecting each other's flaws, they were now two different people, each finding their own way. A year later, it was autumn in Seattle. The leaves were golden and red, and Lena's bookstore, Bookmark, was busy. A big stack of her new book, Reflections, a story about sisters, was displayed with gold ribbons, showing it was a bestseller. Lena stood on a small stage in the bookstore for the book launch. Elliot, her boyfriend, had insisted they do it here. "This is where it all started," he had said. The store was full of people. Some were regular customers who had seen Lena's journey, and others were new readers. Theo was chatting with other writers, and Lena noticed a message from Ela on her tablet. "Your book is in a London bookstore window. Your voice has crossed the ocean. I'm so proud of you." Lena smiled, thinking about how her relationship with Isla had grown. They were no longer mirrors, but two strong women, supporting each other. Isla was thriving in London, creating her own life. "It's time," Elliot whispered, kissing her forehead before introducing her to the crowd. Lena looked around the room, remembering everything that had brought her to this moment. She began, "When I started writing this book, I wanted answers. Why did my sister betray me? Why didn't the man I loved love me enough? But I learned that the answers aren't as important as the questions we ask ourselves." She smiled at Elliot before continuing. "I learned that love isn't about being someone's perfect reflection. It's about being loved for who we truly are." After the event, as the crowd left and the sun cast long shadows through the windows, Lena found Elliot near an old printing press. "A penny for your thoughts?" Elliot asked. Lena picked up a special handmade copy of her book. "I'm thinking about beginnings and endings and how they're sometimes the same thing." Elliot hugged her, and she smiled up at him. "And what is this moment?" "It's both," she said. "The end of this story, but the start of many more that I want to write, with you." That night, as the bookstore grew quiet, Lena opened her laptop. There was an email from Isla. "Dear Mai, your book made me cry, laugh, and forgive myself. Maybe one day I'll write my own version of the story. For now, I'm happy writing my own life in my own words. Love. P.S. Elliot is your true reflection. Don't let him go." Lena smiled as she closed her laptop. Outside, the city lights flickered, but for the first time, Lena felt completely at peace, no longer searching for herself in others, but finally happy with who she was. Thank you for watching. If you like this story and want to see more, please subscribe to our channel. That way you won't miss any new videos. Give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed it and share what you think in the comments. We love hearing your thoughts. Also, don't forget to check out the other videos on our channel. We'll see you in the next story.